We're looking at a rider from the Caucasus region. It's where the weapon we're going to look at today came from, and riding culture is a big part of it. These are a very hardy people. This has been compared to kind of like the Wild West of Eurasia. And this famed region is, as you can see here, basically between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. And because of that placement, this is an area that saw a lot of conflict. You are hemmed in by, in today's terms, we would say Turkey, Iran, and Russia. So in terms of empires, the Persians, the Ottomans, and the Russians all had presences here in various levels of control in different parts of history. It was a real crossroads of civilization in that way. It's also considered basically a middle ground between Western Asia and Eastern Europe. The cultural and ethnic history there is pretty complicated for that reason, and I'm definitely no expert in it. Here's an old painting of a Caucasian rider. I'll show a couple more like it, so give you an idea of the people that we're talking about here. Notice, by the way, the sword that's packed up there on his left. Now, the types of weapons warriors from this area would use, of course, changed throughout history, and they'd be the usual suspects, but you always had, here's a depiction of a battle, by the way, in this region, but you also always had a horse whip or crop of some kind. This was a ubiquitous item in antiquity, right? Didn't matter where you were. If you were in the horse age, so to speak, then you probably used something like today's item. And in other cultures, like today's item, a self-defense or martial use was sometimes incorporated. So for a far-flung example, here's a Native American quirt, basically the same thing, that I showed in a previous video. Look at the lashes on the left, that's what you're going to normally strike the horse with, but this also clearly serves as a full-power billy club. So if you get into a fight or are in a full-scale battle and don't have anything else handy at the moment, you use this. Or in our case, this. So I'll just let you take a look at it here. Footage is more jittery than I would have liked, sorry. This is obviously not a poor man's riding accessory. It's decorated with silver, obviously had a lot of work put into the looks. And here you can see where the handle is just starting to be opened. See over on the left, that division, that this is not an impact weapon when you need it. It's an edged weapon. There's a blade concealed within the hollow body. Not an arrangement unique to this culture at all. This kind of contrivance was used in Victorian England as just one example. Here's one from that time and place. Now back to ours. Here's the blade. Not something you would want to rely on in a full-fledged battle, of course, but it could certainly be a lifesaver in many a situation. And this blade is clearly designed for self-defense only. This is not meant to cut up your dinner, slice some rope, this and that, you know. It could be brought out for those purposes in a pinch, but this is specifically designed as a concealed weapon. And now let's talk about how to classify and label that weapon. This one here was being sold as a nagaika. You can see the spelling here in this Wikipedia entry. And you can also see that one very much like our item is pictured there. Okay, great, so that's what it is. The thing is, the term nagaika, and again, that's as close as I'm going to get to pronouncing it correctly, normally means something else, as the very description here in this entry says. Braided leather, metal at the tip of the whip. Well, that's nothing like the pictured item or ours. What that describes is this kind of a thing, normally called a nagaika or a volchatka. And it's a horsewhip also, that's basically what it's for, from the same part of the world as ours, the Caucasus, Ukraine, southern Russia. And if you watch my channel, then you know that I would consider this a sap, and I do. So this is a flexible, weighted impact weapon made with leather, encasing metal. This was also a horse riding instrument that could be used for self-defense. But there's no concealment with it. You just use the whip on your enemy instead of your horse. The names then overall are fungible and get a little confusing. One thing to know is that the Western world's, self-defense / horse instrument would generally be more of a riding crop. Like the Victorian one I showed earlier, and a crop is more of a straight, it still has flexibility to it, but it's more of a straight and more of a rigid tool. Sherlock Holmes's favorite weapon was a loaded riding crop. Now remember that the item we're looking at today was certainly for a man of means, so same use case, if you will, in a different world. If you were a man of means and you were riding a horse, then your horsewhip or crop might be augmented to provide protection if necessary. Let's look at some similar examples, very similar to the one we have. So it was definitely a thing, right? It was a actual type, not just a one-off experiment or something like that, or a very short-lived one. Looking at this and the following images, clearly this was a popular configuration, even down to the individual look, right? You always have at least in these pictures, always the same color, the silver color, fine embellishments on the surface, the straight pointed blade. Well, with a hollow shaft this straight and narrow, I guess you wouldn't have much choice but to make your blade that way, but you know what I'm saying. It's obviously the same kind of knife. By the way, just have to say on a martial arts nerd's note, if I had to fight with this and nothing else, don't ditch the shaft with the whip, even though that whip's not going to cause much damage at all. You would hold that in your offhand. You could use it to distract and maybe even blind your opponent while wielding the knife in your dominant hand. You know, that reminds me, a long time ago in some self-defense magazine or other, I remember an instructor holding a very short whip, like real short, in his left hand and a knife in the other, and this was like a street-based self-defense system. So I wonder if that kind of a thing is a descendant of something like this. It's possible. I remember wondering at the time, this was a long time ago, decades, like who's going to carry a super short whip and a knife? And now back to ours. This is a 9-inch blade, by the way. It has a central fuller, we're looking at one of them here, of course, on both sides. Funny for such a small item, I don't think the weight reduction would really make a difference, but maybe it was just more for decoration. You know, we've been talking about Caucasian riders and warriors a lot. When some of you saw this item here, or the volchatkas, also called nagaikas, but the leather braided instruments, you probably thought of Cossack warriors from basically the same area. And yeah, it was quite possible this was owned by one of them, but that's not certain. Like I said, this was all in a serious cultural crossroads. In fact, the first person to appraise this one here in particular described it as Cossack or Circassian in origin. The word Circassian, Circassian, gives you an indication certainly of the heterogeneous mix of people we're talking about. Here you can see right above my hand the ricasso. I think that's the fancy name for the unsharpened base of the blade. Now here's a different one, again just showing how popular this was. I say popular, but I mean you don't run across these every day, don't get me wrong. And here's an interesting variation. It's close enough that I included it. Look at that heavy-duty whip that's attached. That would definitely be more formidable if you had to use that side in a fight. And that's it for our tour of this fascinating little item. I'll show you a couple more reviews. This is obviously the real deal. I would say it also looks like it was carried and used for quite a while, especially when you look at the end of the whip, like there. Not something that was made or, purchased and then just kept at home. Now I'll let you see it from pommel to tip, and that'll be it. Thanks.